Hey everyone, and welcome to this live session of Professor Park. This, this live session is meant to celebrate this channel passing 5,000 subscribers. So first and foremost, I want to express my deep appreciation for everyone for joining me. When I started this channel a few months ago, I did not think anyone would want to listen. That was one of the main hurdles on my way to starting it in the first place. So to get 5,000 people to join was just a great surprise to me. This channel is based on the basic idea that history has never been more relevant than the present. And now that history is under siege, even more so. I mean, just this week we saw news about how the Smithsonian Museum of American History's exhibits are going to be under review. That means we need more, not fewer, hard discussions about these history topics. So please make sure that you are subscribed to this channel so we can continue having this dialogue. The way today's session is going to go is I have a few introductory remarks. I had asked in advance for people both on YouTube and on my various social media channels for questions that you wanted me to answer in this video. I was very grateful to get many more than I can answer in this space, so I'll try to keep it fast-paced. And I already see several questions coming in the comments, so I'm really glad to see several of you joining me and asking your questions. Please keep them coming, and I will try to get as many questions as I can. I want to start with probably the most common question I get, both in advance of this video and in general on my social media channels. And this is a question from one subscriber who asked, how has your personal faith background influenced your scholarship? And how has your scholarship affected your personal beliefs? Do you think that your background helps you to synthesize ideas about ways to look at Mormon history in ways that other scholars don't? This is a great question, and it gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about my personal background, which is the topic that I frequently get asked. I was raised in the LDS tradition. I attended Brigham Young University. I served an LDS mission to Washington, D.C. for 2 years, which I absolutely loved. After graduating from BYU, while I was a student at BYU, I actually worked as a research assistant for the Joseph Smith Papers Project, so I was deeply involved learning from those phenomenal scholars who work on that project. I taught in the BYU religion department for a couple of years while I was a graduate student. But then I went on and got my graduate degrees at the University of Edinburgh in their divinity school, then at the University of Cambridge, first a master's in politics and then a PhD in history. And like many people, my own personal faith and belief evolved. I've not been active in the LDS faith for a number of years by this point, but I don't make a big thing of that, in part because I think my own background is the least interesting thing I can talk about. There's so many much more interesting things and people that I like to discuss. And second, I don't like how people often try to equate someone's activity or belief with their scholarship. Much of what I try to do is an attempt to decouple those ideas. I also have lots of respect of people who are full-blown believers in the LDS tradition and are fully active. There are people who know far more than me about Mormon history who are still believers and active, and there are people who don't know as much as me who aren't active, and vice versa. So I try not to dwell on that. Smart people exist all along the spectrum of belief and activity, and I hope this channel can be a place where everyone can come together and engage history. And that comes into bias. It is important to recognize that the bias that we historians always have. In the scholarly circles, we call this a turn of postmodernism, to where we recognize that there's no such thing as a primeval past that we can capture that's not going to be shaped by our present day understandings. And the goal is to recognize our bias and use that to our advantages, ask questions that other people's aren't asking, and lead you to answers that should hopefully be based in the faith. I recognize that I'm limited in my perspective, that I'm just one point in a broad spectrum of the scholarly discussion. And what I'm trying to do on this channel is to reflect those scholarly discussions and answer those questions, and in many ways point to people who are much smarter than me in this history. All right. We're already getting lots and lots of channels or lots and lots of questions, which is really great. So let me close my preliminary remarks by saying I'm really excited about the future of this channel. If you haven't subscribed to it yet, please do so. Hopefully we'll get to 10,000 people soon. We're also introducing memberships as part of this channel. This has been coming by demand by some people who are asking for more perks or ways to support this channel, because a lot of time and effort does go into it, both by me and by my wonderful producer, Anthony Ambrose, who does a lot of the behind the scenes work that I really appreciate. And so we will be rolling out new memberships in the next few weeks, but I want to emphasize, all my material is going to remain free. It's going to remain open for everyone. The memberships will have a few perks like early access to some videos, prioritization of answering comments, and even some subscriber only things in the future. But we'll talk about that more as it rolls out. All right, let's look at some of the questions that have come in already here. The documentation that David O. McKay, per Greg Prince's interview with Hugh Nibley about McKay, stated in the mid-1960s, Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon. I'm guessing that question means, what did he mean by that? This has gotten some play recently in certain circles. Did David O. McKay, in other words, not believe in the ancient history of the Book of Mormon? Let me say from the outset that it's possible. David O. McKay was one who was a bit odd in the sense of where he doesn't fit in standard orthodoxy and dogma. He did preach things that seem to imply that he believed in the historic Book of Mormon. So some people might take that to the next road, where he was being duplicitous or he was speaking the language of the membership when he's saying those things. I, for one, think that quote can be taken further than the evidence allows. I think David O. McKay was not as orthodox as maybe succeeding presidents of the church. There is a modern conceptions of orthodoxy and dogma that sometimes we try to place on past historical figures that just wasn't there. But I do think in general, David O. McKay accepted the historical claims of the Book of Mormon and the translation of the Book of Mormon and the gold plates. And I think that quote in particular, I haven't done a lot of digging on it. So again, these aren't conclusive, firm thoughts, but a few things on my head. Do you think there's significance to historians being barred from accessing records about the second anointing after 1941? So a few things on that question. One, I think the church is in general very reluctant and hesitant to talk about the second anointing, just period. I mean, it was only recently that they allowed church employees to write about Joseph Smith's second anointing, let alone Heber J. Grant in the 1940s. David Berger, who wrote a number of the important groundbreaking work on the second anointing, he was disciplined for that scholarship. So I think there's a general hesitancy of the church in general to gain access and discuss the second anointing. I'm not aware about the prior or after 1941 point. Maybe that might be a reference to, so the number of second anointings drops precipitously during Heber J. Grant. Maybe that's the point that the person asking the question is referring to. It could also mean that the LDS Church has adopted a policy recently of allowing access to the personal papers of LDS leaders 70 years after their death. That comes close to the 1941 date. So I think those things are in play too. But if you have more specific questions, feel free to ask a question. Do you think the MAGA... oh man, there's a lot more questions coming. Sorry, I'm falling behind. Do you think the MAGA movement has been an overall positive or negative on the church? Anyone who has watched any of my videos talking about modern day politics can probably guess my answer to this. I think MAGA politics has been a scourge and a direct threat to American history writ large. But if I were to put on my scholar hat, and try to think about it from a scholarly perspective. And if you're forcing me to think, okay, what are some benefits that the Mormon community has received from the MAGA movement? I think one thing that some in the church might recognize as a benefit, those especially of the MAGA persuasion, is that it has allowed Latter-day Saints to evaporate the distance between what used to be the distinctive Mormon vote, which was a brand of conservatism, but was not synonymous with American conservatism. It has merged those two worlds even more, which means Mormons are much more aligned with right-wing politics now than they ever have been. And so some might argue that that Mormon alignment with MAGA has granted them more cultural cachet than they've ever experienced. Now, of course, you can counter that by saying that if MAGA ever gets full power, the Mormons might be the very types of people they will target. And again, that's a legitimate conversation that maybe we'll have in the future. All right. Were the reasons Christianity, let's see, sorry. What were the reasons Christianity changed in the 18th and 19th centuries from tolerating slavery as a necessary evil to embracing the total abolition of slavery by the end of the 1800s? Such a great question. This is actually the topic of my current book project. I know I talk a lot about Mormon history on here. In part, that's where a lot of my scholarly background is in, and that's where the books I'm most known for cover. But I work on American religious history writ large, and I'm currently writing a book on an abolitionist movement in Boston in the 1840s and the 1850s. Abolitionists meaning those who are trying to abolish slavery. And this is reflected in recent scholarship that has shown the role of religion in shaping these debates over slavery in antebellum America. A shift, especially in the South, from people seeing slavery as a necessary evil, a quote that was mentioned in that excellent comment, to eventually Southerners seeing slavery as a positive good. All the way to the point when the Confederate States secede from the United States, form their own constitution. They insert God in the Confederate Constitution. The Confederate Constitution is a Christian document because it directly invokes a Christian God, unlike the American Constitution. And it specifies that a godly society is based on what they call the cornerstone of slavery. What led to that movement? Well, there's a couple things. One is slavery was seen as not as profitable in the founding period, that the soil that had been used to till tobacco had been depleted. Slavery seemed a dying economy. So a lot of the founding fathers believed that we don't need to directly address slavery because it is going to die a natural death. Well, what happens in the 1790s? The invention of the cotton gin, the Louisiana Purchase, and American Manifest Destiny moving westward, which made slavery a profitable endeavor and then allowed more land for people to colonize and grow the slave plantations. In response to that growth of slavery, you have lots of Northerners denouncing slavery and forming a religious Christian nationalist vision of abolition. We today identify Christian nationalism as on the right, but in the 19th century, there were plenty of people who identified as Christian nationalists who are pushing progressive causes like trying to abolish slavery. And I argue in my book, like many other scholars have, that the growth of pro-slavery Christian nationalism was both taking advantage of the economic growth that's always tied to the money, and in response to the anti-slavery Christian nationalism in the North. So as a result, the Civil War becomes what one scholar calls a theological crisis, a difference of interpretation of a godly society. And if you want a good book on this, I have this at my disposal. I'm teaching a class on American religious history this semester, and my grad seminar on the topic is including this book, Righteous Strife: How Warring Religious Nationalists Forged Lincoln's Union. It's a phenomenal book that gives a great overview of the religious tapestry, we'll call it, of antebellum America. All right. Do you feel that if the church came out and condemned some of what Trump is doing, some of its members would see things differently? Yes and no. Yes, I believe that it will cause some to see things differently, maybe some on the margins. But I think what the LDS church leaders learned from the pandemic era is that the conservative circles within the LDS church have grown so strong that many in the faith pledge allegiance to political principles rather than ecclesiastical authority. And I think we saw this most played out when the church had to give out a second statement saying, hey, y'all should really get, I say y'all as if they're Texans, you all should get vaccinated and still wear masks at church. And a lot of local members were like, I don't think so. I heard on Newsmax or Fox News that I shouldn't. So I think what we saw there is a limit. It is common for people, including scholars, including myself, to say that the LDS community will always change on a dime as soon as church leaders say something. Where I think church leadership operates on a much more tenuous balance. Yes, they can help change things, and sometimes there is an environment in which followers will be in lockstep. I mean, we saw this with the 1978 racial restriction end, where there are some who probably wanted to continue the racial restriction until the day they died. And then they become the very people who tell the stories of, I remember hearing the radio report at the end of the racial restriction, and I pulled to the side of the road and I cried. We've all heard those stories. So I think there is an element of the truth. But I think that it's becoming even more now that so many Latter-day Saints take their cues from the political world rather than ecclesiastical leadership. Cool bookshelf. How do you organize it? I love questions like that. I wish I could show you around I have bookshelves that go all the way around this room, and then behind where the computer is, I have 10 bookshelves the size of the ones behind me. The shelf that's immediately behind me, that's general US history stuff. So stuff that covers from the colonization to the present. The shelf to the right, this is all Mormon stuff. And this is only about a fourth of my Mormon history books because I keep most of my Mormon history books at my home library. If you go to the shelf to the other side, those are all primary sources, meaning books that have documents from the period under study. I have those next to the door because I often have students who are doing research projects, and I want them to have easy access to books that allow them to dig into historical sources when writing their papers. And on the shelves behind the camera, I have my colonial America, revolutionary America, Civil War America, and 20th century America. And then I have another shelf over there that's all about European and world history stuff. All right, let's see. Sorry, I am... Oh, and thanks for Christopher for the super comment and question. Thanks for your channel. What graduate programs would you recommend to those who might be interested in pursuing the academic study of LDS history? So first of my first response would be make sure you want to do a graduate study in history. The academic world is in tatters right now. It's very difficult to get a job in academia, given the realities of the job market, the disinvestment of higher education from states and the federal government. And so whenever I have students, and I have a lot of students who are interested in going to graduate school in the humanities, I'll put I'll answer the humanities in general, and then I'll talk specifically about LDS history. I say you need three things if you're going to go to graduate school. One, it has to be something you really, really want to do. It's not like a side project. It's not something that, oh, I'm on the fence. It's something that you are willing to put in hard years without a definite future. The comparison most people give now is that it's similar to going to Hollywood. Meaning that it's possible to get a great academic job. It's a great life. I love my life as an academic, just like it's possible to get a Hollywood job, but it's increasingly difficult and most people don't pan out. In the last year, for instance, there are about 1,200 people who received their PhDs in history and about 350 who got tenure or tenure track line. So you have to know that it is what you really want to do. Second, you can't go into debt for it. PhD programs should not be charging you. You should get a stipend and you should get tuition reimbursement. And three, you have to have a clear idea of what type of scholarship you want to do and what you might want to do outside of academia. Gone are the days where your first plan is to become a history professor if you go into a PhD, because a majority of people who get PhDs in history now don't get to become a professor. It's just a sad reality. So you have to, from day one, know what you might take that degree into other things. So now to the question of, if you wanted to do LDS history, where might you go? There's no place where you can get a degree in LDS history. I'm sure you already know this. I'm talking to everyone in general here. There's no place where you're going to get a degree just in LDS history, nor should there be, because that's too narrow a focus. But there are places that have expertise in the type of scholarship that includes Mormonism. So the first question you're going to have to answer is, do you consider yourself more of a historian or a religious studies person? And there are methodological and disciplinary differences between those two. I decided I'm a historian. A lot of people in Mormon studies go the religious studies route. Now, if you go to the religious studies route, there are clear programs that are great. Claremont Graduate University and the University of Virginia both have excellent programs in American religious history. And they also feature Mormon studies professors. It was Kathleen Flake, now it's Lori Maffley Kipp at the University of Virginia, and it's Matthew Bowman at Claremont Graduate University. I'd argue those are the two best scholars in Mormon studies, so you get to work with them. If you go the history route, the University of Utah has Paul Reeve, who is the Simmons Chair of Mormon Studies, and he's phenomenal. And then you would choose, what is your interest beyond LDS history? Are you interested in 20th century American conservatism? If so, then you'd look at someplace like UC Berkeley. Are you interested in 19th century religious experimentation? Then you might go to somewhere like Harvard to work with David Holland and Catherine Brecketts. Feel free to shoot me an email and I can give you more questions, but those are a few questions off the top of my head. How relevant is your scholarship on church history to current church operations? And is it appropriate or important to research and critique church operations and culture today in light of LDS history? That's a great question. And I will say that many scholars are hesitant to connect their scholarly focus from the past all the way to the present. I don't like that hesitancy. I think historians should show that, in the words I close every video with, that history is relevant. And so when I wrote my book, American Zion, here it is behind me, I wanted to move it all the way to the present. So I dedicated the final chapter to just covering the last decade, because I believed it was important that history shapes modern church operations. Is it the most important element? Is history the most important element to understand church operations? Probably it's not the only one. Anthropology, sociology, religious studies, those different people can say that there are different elements at play. But I firmly believe, I'm a historian, so of course I believe this, I firmly believe that we are made by our history, that we live in a world that is on the shoulders of everything that came before. So I think historians should not be hesitant to connect our history to the modern world. All right. Can you discuss the circumstances around the removal of the lecture of faith from the canon? Was there pushback from membership? Is there a good book on that? Thank you so much for the question. I think you're one of the ones that asked the question in advance. So I actually had it in my list to make sure to get through today. The Lectures on Faith was a series of lectures produced as part of a church education program in preparation for the Kirtland Temple. So in 1834 to 1835, they form a theological school, comes to be known as the School of the Prophets. And as part of that, they they created these series of lectures that the students were going to repeat verbatim, meaning they're memorizing and they're repeating. That's how theological education was done back then. The primary authors for the Lecture on Faith, the primary author was likely Sidney Rigdon. It reads very much like Sidney Rigdon. It reflects the type of schooling that he was interested in, but it was signed off by Joseph Smith and Frederick Williams and other church leaders. It was a series of 7 lectures. It was initially titled On Faith. The Lecture on Faith was a title that was not added until the 1876 Doctrine and Covenants by Orson Pratt, but it always had this awkward relationship to the scriptural canon. Now, it was published in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. Some people claim, and I don't see the full evidence, and I could poke holes in this if you'd like. Some people claim that when it said Doctrine and Covenants, that the lectures on faith were the doctrine, and then the revelations were the covenants. I don't like that schematic because I think they understood a lot of the revelations as containing doctrine as well, but I can get too much in the weeds here. But I want to insist that there was discomfort with its place within the church canon from very early on, and it was admitted to the canon. Like, they voted on it as members of the church, saying that we sustain that this is going to be added to the book of Scripture. The RLDS Church removed the lectures on faith by the late 1800s, I think like 1897 or so. And then it was removed by James Talmage in 1921 for the new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. There's several reasons why it always held this awkward position and why it was ultimately removed. Primarily because it did not fully fit the evolving Mormon theology. Its doctrine of the Godhood seemed to diverge from what Joseph Smith ends up teaching in Nauvoo. Now, there are some who dispute that, as recently as Bruce R. McConkie, who, and I'm going to take on my Bruce R. McConkie voice here, who said, anyone who claims that it is a false theology and lectures on faith does not understand theology. And that he would argue that it's more like theological terminology that was different. And he actually tried to restore the lecture on faith to the Doctrine and Covenants. But most scholars agree that it seems to reflect a different theology of the Trinity than what Joseph Smith eventually teaches in Nauvoo, which is one reason why it was eventually removed. Now, to your question of was there pushback from members on this? This is an interesting question because the lecture on faith was sustained by church members to be added to the Doctrine and Covenants, and then it was removed without a vote. Theoretically, that's not supposed to happen, but it shows that the faith is not always systematic. It's not always consistent in the ideas, and sometimes they're flying by the seat of their pants. Now, I think the person who asked this question also asked a preliminary question that added more that I really enjoyed, of especially comparing the lecture on faith, which had a definite Joseph Smith authorship, or he didn't author it, but he at least sustained it, right? And it was sustained in the canon. How does that compare with something like Doctrine and Covenants 130, which is one of my pet topics that I love talking about to show the messiness of these revelations that end up becoming compiled? Because you have the first D&C 135, which seemed a clear compilation of Joseph Smith saying, here are the revelations, here's the lectures on faith, here's a statement on marriage, by the way, another thing that gets quietly removed and replaced with D&C 132. Whereas later on, when Orson Pratt puts together the 1876 Doctrine and Covenants, Orson Pratt is working in the church historian's office. He just gathers a lot of historical documents. And sometimes he thinks, oh, this is a cool document. Let's add it to the D&C. And one of those is what comes to be known as D&C 130, which was one of the most awkward conglomeration of documents. If you read it, it reads differently than all the revelations. That's because it's a collection of William Clayton and Willard Richards' notes from Joseph Smith delivering a 2-hour discourse. And they jot down like 10 things, and then they keep it in their diaries. Then 40 years later, Orson Pratt takes those diaries and goes, oh, this is cool. And he just kind of copies and pastes it. And that's suddenly D&C 130, which kind of shows the scattered nature, this messy process behind the creation of these revelations that we sometimes overlook. All right. Can you comment on the relationship between Joseph Smith, temple ceremonies, and Freemasonry? The similarities are obvious. How did Freemasons feel about the similarities and Joseph? Great question. So, I mean, the base, let's get the basics and fundamentals out of the way. The LDS temple endowment, as Joseph Smith introduced in Nauvoo, was clearly an appropriation of Masonic rituals. I mean, the timetable is quite clear. Joseph Smith is introduced to Freemasonry in late 1841, early 1842. By February, they get a Masonic lodge. They get permission from the state Masonic organization to create the Nauvoo Lodge, and they have a grand ordination ceremony. And then several weeks later, Joseph Smith introduces the temple rituals that have clear similarities. And the saints recognize this. I mean, it was, I might mistake the apostles in the story, but I think it was Heber C. Kimball writing to Parley P. Pratt, who was away on a mission, saying Joseph Smith has restored the true form of Masonry. Right? Joseph Smith argued that Masonry was an apostatized, handed down version of what was originally this pristine temple ritual, and that now he is restoring this. Now, Masons were uncomfortable with the Mormons, but not for the reasons you might think. First of all, they didn't know that Joseph Smith was introducing temple rituals that were appropriating Masonic rituals. That just wasn't as much public knowledge as it is now. What the Masons were uncomfortable with were the number of Mormons who were joining in on Masonry practices. Within several months, there were more members of the Nauvoo Masonic Order than the rest of the state of Illinois combined. And so they worried that Mormons were introducing way too many people to it. They weren't allowing the secret order to persist. And so the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge was suspended at some point. Now, later on, news would come out about the Mormon temple rituals, and eventually Masons and Mormons hated each other. There's a wonderful book by Michael Homer on Mormonism and Masonry that talks about this later history, that for a long time, Masons were not allowed to be Mormons and Mormons weren't allowed to be Masons due to this rivalry that came up. Who do you believe was the most influential prophet of the last 100 years? Last 100. So going back to 1925, I'm gonna take. Now, I can make a case for several prophets. Heber J. Grant introducing a lot of modern reforms was quite crucial in turning the church from this weird oddity to a denomination. David O. McKay, who introduced the grand global image of Mormonism. And I mean, the church nearly triples in size during his near 2 decades. Spencer W. Kimball introduces the end of the racial restriction, as well as kind of helps Mormonism start move toward the religious right. Gordon B. Hinckley, is a media darling among he introduces the modern Mormonism. And then Russell M. Nelson is introducing a lot of reforms now that I think are going to be quite substantial going forward. But I'm actually going to turn this question on its head and argue that the most influential LDS leader of the last 100 years was not a prophet. Instead, it was J. Reuben Clark, who joins the First Presidency as a counselor in 1933. And a major argument in my book, American Zion, is that he shapes over the next decade what modern Mormonism comes to be. That modern Latter-day Saints live in the church that J. Reuben Clark largely built. And I'm going to be doing some videos on that in the future. So that would be my answer. Can you share your argument on Fanny Alger as an affair as opposed to a proto-plural wife, especially what we know about Eliza R. Snow's knowledge of the involvement? Yeah, this is a good question. Thanks, Matthew, for the question. And let me state at the outset that historians disagree on this. That in fact, among all the scholars who work on Joseph Smith and acknowledge that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, there is not a credentialed, credible historian who does not believe Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. But there is lots of debate among those historians over what polygamy entailed and when it began. And among all those historians, I'm probably in a minority who believes that Fanny Alger was just an affair. Now, I'll outline the reasons why people believe that Fanny Alger was a plural wife. You have some later reminiscences from family members. But importantly, you have Eliza R. Snow, who, of course, was intimately involved with Joseph Smith, a plural wife of Joseph Smith himself, might have lived with the Alger family in Kirtland, and she identified Fanny Alger as a plural wife when Joseph F. Smith and Richard other historians were trying to dig it up. Andrew Jensen, that's the name I was trying to come up with. Why I don't accept it is twofold. One, as I think a lot of those accounts are problematic in their later reminiscence for it. Now, reminiscences can't be dismissed out of hand because there's a lot of reminiscences that are true and can be relied on. But if you go one by one, I think those ones fall apart a bit easier. But most importantly to me, the theology that shaped how Joseph Smith introduced and practiced polygamy just wasn't there in Nauvoo. He does not start teaching that theology. He does not start creating, innovating that theology, or if you're a Latter-day Saint, revealing that theology until 1840, 1841, I argue in response to the tragedy and trauma experienced in Nauvoo, or sorry, in Missouri. And so I just don't think that theology is there. So that's one major point why I think Fanny Alger was just an affair, not a plural wife or proto-plural wife. Two is I define it as affair because that's how Oliver Cowdery defined it. I think few people were closer to Joseph Smith during these years than Oliver Cowdery. And if Joseph Smith was teaching a proto-biblical type of understanding of polygamy, I think Oliver Cowdery would have known about it, and he would have known about the this relationship to Fanny Alger, but instead he calls it an affair. And so now I know there are some arguments that maybe Joseph Smith was basing this on a sense of biblical mimesis, that biblical patriarchs had plural wives, so therefore modern prophets should, and that's possible. I'm not closing the door. I'm just saying when I assess all the evidence and weigh them within their context, in the end, I think Oliver Cowdery's accusation that it was a affair is the evidence that shows the strongest. But again, there's debate on that. Another question. Do you have an opinion about John Ludwell's claim that the biggest anachronism in the Book of Mormon is the book itself, that a literate society as described would have left mounds of evidence? That's a great question, and I don't know. I try to avoid Book of Mormon historicity questions. That's just, honestly, it's not as interesting to me. And this actually goes into a question that I received in advance of what's the general scholarly consensus on the origins of the Book of Mormon. Now, of course, Latter-day Saint scholars are going to have a consensus that it's historic in some degree, although there seems to be a growing number that see it more as inspired fiction. And that it's an expansion of inspired texts, and that they see inspired fiction as a form of scripture. But that's not probably the dominant view. Many Latter-day Saints still believe. Now, scholars outside the faith obviously aren't going to buy that. And so when I write my book, I operate from the presumption that the Book of Mormon is a modern text created in 1820s, speaking to a modern world. But I think the question of the origins and the scholarly consensus is often referring to, did Joseph Smith use other resources? Did someone else write it? Or is there always the ghost of the Spalding theory haunting, which somehow has come up recently? Every scholar that I talk to, and I talk to a lot, I serve as the co-chair of the Mormon Studies Unit for the American Academy of Religion, and I was the co-editor for the Mormon Studies Review for years. Every scholar that I talk to who has investigated the origins of the Book of Mormon from a secular perspective all agree that in their minds, Joseph Smith wrote it. What his motivation was behind it, it might differ, but the scholarly consensus, whether right or wrong, is that the Book of Mormon was a production of Joseph Smith and reflects the cultural anxieties of 1820s America. Now, I am interested in how Mormons over the years have tried to shape their apologia or their defenses of the Book of Mormon, which is where things like this claim of how do you deal with the anachronisms of the Book of Mormon and the book itself, that there should be mounds of evidence. I'm fascinated with how Mormons have tried to answer that question, even if I never find any of their answers that plausible. All right. Did Joseph Smith use habeas corpus in Nauvoo to avoid arrest because of it working or because of a lack of judicial knowledge? That is a great question coming from Richard Park, who I'm pretty sure, yep, I'm seeing the logo. That is my father. So hi, Dad. Great to see you. So some background knowledge for behind that question. In Nauvoo, Joseph Smith, there were 3 occasions in which the state of Missouri tries to extradite Joseph Smith back for trial based on questions of lingering issues from the Mormon-Missouri War of 1838. Joseph Smith probably rightly and at least understandably believed that the moment he set foot back in Missouri, he would be killed. He's actually probably right on that. So he tried to use every legal mechanism at his disposal to escape that extradition. And the most common thing he ends up using each of these 3 times is habeas corpus. Now, habeas corpus is a legal Latin phrase that present the body. It means to review whether someone was arrested on legal grounds. A habeas corpus hearing and ruling says nothing about the original case and whether the person is innocent or not, is just whether they were arrested correctly. And in each of these 3 occasions, Joseph Smith becomes increasingly bold in what we'll call an innovative use, all the way to the point to where in 1843, the Nauvoo City Council passes a law that every arrest warrant issued for someone in Nauvoo by a body outside of Nauvoo would first have to face a habeas corpus ruling in Nauvoo by a group of Nauvoo people to determine whether it is a valid arrest warrant. Not whether the arrest is correct, but whether the case itself is legitimate. This was, and I want to be clear, not a valid legal approach. And in fact, the Saints are eventually forced to repeal their habeas corpus revisions. But the question here is, was Joseph Smith's innovative use of habeas corpus based on the system not working, or that he just genuinely did not know how the system worked? I don't think Joseph Smith was an expert in law. I don't think he was reading up on Blackstone's cases, and I don't think he was up to date on the state of Illinois Constitution. But I think he was surrounded by people who did explain to him. So, for instance, one of the first judges that allow him off on habeas corpus was none other than Stephen Douglas, who eventually becomes Illinois senator and the author of Popular Sovereignty and a Major Issue figure in 1850s America. And he tells Joseph Smith, here's the limits of what you can do it, and I will take you up to those limits and let you go if in return you're going to support the Democratic Party. Later on, I think Joseph had a talent for listening to the advice that he wanted to believe in. So I think, sure, a case can be made that Joseph Smith genuinely did not know how habeas corpus works. So his innovations in it was a genuine expression of trying something he believed was legal. But at the very least, I think it's fair to say that his actions were reckless. And that they were, in his mind, an expression of the existing judicial system not working. In other words, he would turn to he would look at the American judicial system and say, how is it that I can be extradited to Missouri where an extra legal body is going to lynch me as soon as I set foot? Where is the justice there? America promises a trial by your peers. And the best way to set up a trial by your peers is having these habeas corpus hearings in Nauvoo. So my answer is, was it innocence or creativity? I'm going to say yes, it's both. What is the general academic view of the hypothesis that Joseph Smith made his own plates out of tin via manifesting? He and other believers saw the real gold plates with their spiritual eyes. That's a great question. It goes into this complicated scholarly dance that academics have to make, which is they don't accept that there were real gold plates. I mean, if they did, they would be Mormons, right? But they're not Mormons, and so they don't accept that there were real gold plates. But there are so many firsthand accounts of there being something there, that there being some physical plates, with some scholars like Dan Vogel saying that Joseph Smith created plates out of tin that he then, carried around under a blanket that allowed other people to feel the physicality. There have been some fascinating scholarly proposals just in the last 5 years that try to offer a remedy for this. One is by the scholar Anne Browdy, who argues that Joseph Smith saw the creation of the gold plates through tin or whatever, similar to how Catholic priests see the transformation of the Eucharist into the blood and body of Christ, that it was a sacred collaboration between human and divine to create something new. And so that's one argument that some scholars, a religious studies scholar, have offered to understand Joseph Smith creating physical plates that others believed were real, but actually weren't ancient gold plates. Another proposal by the Florida State scholar Sonia Hazard, who has a new book coming out this fall that talks about print culture and early Americans and evangelicals. She argues that it's possible that Joseph Smith discovered printing plates on the side of the road. And she used some examples of what these printing plates that are often backwards and upside down from regular text, which makes them look like Reformed Egyptian or whatever, that he found those plates and used them, whether consciously or not, in his religious truth claims. I don't buy necessarily either of these proposals, but I think they're interesting. And I think they're an example of these scholars yearning to take Joseph Smith's claims seriously. And in the words of Sonia Hazard, operating in the same world of our historical subjects, that they claim there is something physical. How do we reckon with it? Well, you can just say that Joseph Smith created it and therefore he's a fraud or a pious fraud in Dan Vogel's terms. Or you can try to create these other scholarly apparatuses to grant him a bit more of a religious creativity and innovation. All right, let's see. Is this being recorded view later? Yes, it is. Is there a Book of Mormon with historical critical notes, noting texts he copied from, anachronisms, etc.? The best edition of the Book of Mormon is, let me see if I have it here. Apparently I don't. Grant Hardy's Oxford edition of the Book of Mormon has both textual variants listed in the footnotes. It has background. It places it within the context of other world scripture. It just came out. It was published in the Oxford History of Scripture line, meaning the same line that they produce their Bible, their Quran, their Book of Mormon. Grant Hardy is the best scholar on the Book of Mormon. That's probably the best historical critical book. If you're looking for something that's going to be showing this was copied from this text, this is the relation, this proves that it was fraud, this book doesn't do it. This book operates from the perspective of understanding it as a book of world scripture in which it's not trying to denounce, but most religious scholars don't try to denounce and upend scriptural texts. Instead, they're trying to understand how they operate on their own terms and in the world of believers, and that's what the book does. If you're looking for a historical critical Book of Mormon that tries to trace Book of Mormon passages to areas that Joseph Smith might have directly borrowed from, I'm not sure what a volume might be. So sorry on that. Let's see. Is it accurate that Fanny quickly married after moving from Kirtland and gave birth to a daughter named Josephina? A wonderful scholar named Dave Golding, who works for the LDS Church, has done a lot of digging on Fanny Alger after the Mormon episode, kind of tracing out how Fanny Alger as a historical figure just kind of operates as a shadow to Mormon historians and only in the convenience of understanding Joseph Smith, whereas scholars, we should understand figures on their own sake. And so he's actually dug into the life of Fanny Alger. I don't remember all the specifics that he's dug out of her life. He presented on her at a recent Mormon History Association meeting. I do think she gets married pretty good. So she moves out of Kirtland very quickly. I do think she gets married quickly afterwards. I don't think she has a child named Josephina. I could be corrected, but that doesn't, I think that would ring familiar if he had said that. What is clear is she moves on from Mormonism. She does not deal with it. She does not show much affinity. I think she goes through her own spiritual transformation, affiliating with different religious groups. I think you can at least get a taste of bare bones. David Golding works for the LDS Church's history department in producing kind of their supplemental materials for their curriculum, like the gospel topic essays and the gospel topics Q&A pages. He produced a lot of those topic pages that go with the Saints volumes. And I think he created a topics overview of Fanny Alger life that went with the Saints volume. So I would recommend going to check that out, at least for the basic background for Alger's life after Kirtland. What are your thoughts on B.H. Roberts' book, Studies on the Book of Mormon, Volume 1 and 2? And if you lost testimony before that, I love the study of B.H. Roberts. He is an endlessly fascinating person. And in my book, American Zion, he's a key figure. And I actually have a whole section where I talk about his studies in the Book of Mormon. You mentioned volumes 1 and 2, but there's actually 3 different documents that kind of get grouped together in his studies of the Book of Mormon. So the bare summary of what goes on. B.H. Roberts is a lifelong apologist and defender for the LDS Church, publishes 30 some odd books, many of which get adopted as curriculum for the LDS Church. And then in 1922, sorry, I always want to live in the 1800s. In 1922, he received, or church leaders receive a letter. William Ritter, I think is the guy's name. He was a member of the church out in Washington, D.C., who sends a letter to James Talmage, I believe, saying, here are some critiques of the Book of Mormon I've seen recently, and I would love for someone to address them. And Talmage passes them on to B.H. Roberts, and B.H. Roberts does some digging, assuming that they're going to be easy questions asked. He spent his entire career responding to evangelical critiques of the Book of Mormon and providing an apologia for the scripture. But these questions were different. They were based in new modernist scholarship. They dealt with things like the creation of languages or population, showing that the general assumptions that come out of the Book of Mormon just aren't possible when you look at a scientific study of the Americas. And it rocks him. He ends up writing several tracts for different audiences. The first one specifically for church authorities, saying, here are the problems. I assume they'd be easy to solve, but they're not. They're difficult, and I don't have answers to them. I think several things can be true at once with these texts from, and by the way, the church leaders decide not to do anything with them. So B.H. Roberts is just forced to kind of pocket them, and then they don't. Those manuscripts don't see the light of the day until the 1980s, when some descendants partner with Signature Books and they publish his studies in the Book of Mormon. I think B.H. Roberts no longer believed in the traditional defenses and understanding of the Book of Mormon. Did that mean that he did not believe the Book of Mormon was historical, that there were ancient Nephites? I'm generally not sure. I think several things can be true at once. One, he no longer believed in the traditional defenses of the Book of Mormon. I think that's clear. But I think it's also true that he didn't know what was then going to replace it. Did that mean that Joe Smith just created the Book of Mormon on his own? I mean, one of the 3 studies of the Book of Mormon texts compared the Book of Mormon to Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews. And so maybe he believed Joe Smith created it on his own. Was the Book of Mormon this scriptural fiction that Joe Smith created in collaboration with God? Maybe that's possible. Or maybe there were historical reasons for a historical Joe Smith that B.H. Roberts just didn't understand. I think that's possible as well. I think it's clear that when he wrote those texts, he was meaning to come across more as a caustic. He was meaning to make them as a legal brief, making a case that our traditional understandings do not work, and here is why. Which means that I think it's also possible that those texts went beyond what he personally might have believed. So this is a very layered answer, and I know it's very boring for historians to say it's complicated, but it's complicated. I think B.H. Roberts no longer believed in the traditional understandings of the Book of Mormon. What that meant about his beliefs in the Book of Mormon, I think that would require more dissection. I might do a whole video on this in the future. Let's see. I'm looking for... Oh, let's see. Sorry, just a second. I'm having some issues with my scrolling here. I want to thank Kitty Corner for her super fan comment. I don't see a comment from you. If you have a comment or questions, please feel free to leave it, Kitty. Let's see. Oh man, there are way more questions coming up now. Sorry guys, I'm falling behind. Is the Mormon History Association in agreement to point out flaws in Mormon theology? First of all, you all should join the Mormon History Association. It's a wonderful scholarly organization that's coming up on its 60th anniversary. And it's a scholarly, credible organization that includes both believing LDS, ex-LDS, and non-Latter-day Saint scholars. Its goal is not to point out the flaws in Mormon theology and history, but instead to understand the history, particularly within the broader context. It does not prioritize LDS truth claims, nor does it prioritize, ex-LDS narratives. It is meant to be a scholarly understanding, and you can then take that understanding two different directions. So the Mormon History Association is somewhere where you can hear both a Dan Vogel and a Brian Hales speaking with very divergent views. Next year's academic conference is going to be held in Las Vegas, and I am currently the president of the Mormon History Association. It's a one-year term. It's a great honor. Behind me on my shelf, a little higher, you see the presidential seer stone. It's the totem that's passed down. My daughter added the googly eyes, so that's not traditional. But the Mormon History Association is dedicated to accurate academic history, not to reaffirming or debunking Mormon truth claims. All right, the question I think from Kitty: can you tell us more about the Kingdom of Nauvoo movie and that may be coming? Who would you like to see play Joseph Smith? So Kingdom of Nauvoo is my book that was published in 2020. It's a book that many people know me for. I was very privileged for the book to receive the Best Book Award from the Mormon History Association, as well as a few other great honors. And then it was optioned by a Hollywood group for either a dramatic series or a feature film. And that's all the information I have at this point. It's been going on, I think it's been optioned for 3 or 4 years now. They're working on a script. I know that team has been working on other movie scripts that are moving into production. And I was told by them that they are hoping to start paying attention to the Nauvoo project sometime soon. Who knows if that happens? Most of these books that get optioned into films, they might languish for a long time. Some might be created, some other. I will let you know as soon as I have updates, because yes, I would love to see it on film as well. Who would I like to see Joseph Smith? Not Dean Cain. For those of you who might not know the joke, Dean Cain played Joseph Smith in September Dawn, a very bad movie about the Mountain Meadows massacre, and he was fascinating, but not the best choice for Joseph. Who would I? That's a great question. If I think of a person, I'll let you know. I love book recommendations. Would love to see more. I can give you lots of book recommendations all day. Just last week, I think it was, I did a video on my favorite books that incorporate Mormonism into American history with Adam Jortner's No Place for Saints on the Mormon-Missouri conflict. Sally Gordon's The Mormon Question about Mormon polygamy and religious liberty in America. Paul Reeves' Religion of a Different Color on Mormonism and Whiteness. Colleen McDonald's Sister Saints on Mormon women's cincy and polygamy, and Taylor Petrie's Tabernacles of Clay on the LDS Church and gay rights in the last 50 years. Those are just a few, but every week I give you more recommendations of books. Let's see. After the Second Manifesto, how were polygamists, not fundamentalists, treated by local wards and the institution itself? They would have been alive for decades after the Second Manifesto. That's a great question. And in fact, there's a wonderful article by Craig Ostler, who is a Mormon historian and apologist who's done a lot with The Interpreter, but he co-authored an article, or he co-edited a volume titled Mormon, I'm trying to remember the first title, but there's a trilogy of books on Mormon polygamy, edited volumes with lots of chapters, one covering the Joseph Smith era, one covering the rest of the 19th century, and one covering post-manifesto polygamy. And Craig Ostler does a chapter in that third volume where he talks about this polygamous family that existed awkwardly with their ward for quite a while. So after the Second Manifesto, these polygamists faced either ostracizing within their wards if they continued to live polygamy, or they faced, issues if they were to give up their polygamous wives. So there's two groups here I'm talking about. I'm sorry, I'm darting around a bit. One is there are those who had polygamous sealings before the Second Manifesto, right? And so they are in good standing, even if their sealings were a bit scandalous to church authorities. They existed for decades afterwards. I mean, there were, and there are some even up to 1910 being sealed by their temple sealer or their stake president, but were ostracized in public. Then there are those who were sealed after that point. Those people in after were often ostracized. Those in the first camp were sometimes ostracized. So I don't have a lot of good background. I would say that most of them, if I'm remembering the key takeaways from Craig Osler's excellent article, some of them chose that the best option was to no longer live as polygamous families, that they just decided to live separately, and that broke up families. And those that did decide to continue living in their polygamous families faced a lot of public concern, especially with the rise of the fundamentalist movement, and they wanted to emphasize, we're not polygamous like them. Anyways, great question. I can see Joseph as pious fraud in the Book of Mormon Kirtland days, but struggle to see in the Nauvoo days. Do you endorse a pious fraud view at any place in the timeline? I don't like the phrase or the interpretive schema of pious fraud. I think that seems to place a lot of our modern assumptions on how religious authority and operate back then, and it assumes a lot on sincerity that we frankly can't answer. And further, I'm convinced by the scholarship of non-Mormon scholars like Lori Maffley Kipp, who argue that by framing early Mormonism around this pious fraud narrative of Joseph Smith, we're missing the sincere belief of everyone who surrounded Joseph Smith. So in other words, if we accept the interpretive schema of Joseph Smith as a pious fraud, we then view everyone else around him as deluded fanatics. And that's A, just not very charitable to understand figures. And B, it misses the dynamics of belief. So this is actually why most scholars don't like the term fraud. They don't like the word cult. They don't use those interpretive schemas because it means placing people in these partisan frameworks. Now, I want to emphasize that I understand for many people today, especially those who are ex-Mormon or leaving the faith, terms like pious fraud and cult are useful. And I'm not going to tell you how to define viewing these traditions or movements or people that you might see as harmful. But I'm just saying from a scholarly perspective, if you want to understand these figures, especially within their cultural context and unpack their societal meaning, then I just don't find terms like pious fraud as that useful. All right. Will you discuss the origins and discoveries of the Pearl of Great Price, specifically the Book of Abraham? I see many apologists push the idea that what we have isn't exactly what Joseph Smith, I'm guessing that should end, said. So the Pearl of Great Price is another collection of documents related to Joseph Smith and early Mormonism that do not get canonized until the late 1870s. Now, they're a collection of some sources that are very clearly brought from Joseph Smith. The Book of Abraham and the Book of Moses. Those are very clearly directly from Joseph Smith. We have those documents in his hand. I don't think you can say that that anything in those were later revised. In fact, Joseph Smith publishes those while he's alive. The Book of Moses, well, I guess he doesn't publish. Oh yeah, the Book of Moses is published in the Evening and Morning Star, the LDS newspaper. And so he oversees those publications. And the Book of Abraham is also published during his time in the Times and Seasons, the Nauvoo newspaper. I will note that I think a mistake is people combining the Book of Abraham together and seeing it as a product of one text, whereas I really think that the Book of Abraham, the first chapter and then the first few verses of the second chapter, are a product of 1835 Kirtland Mormonism, and then everything else is the product of Nauvoo Mormonism, but maybe that's a topic for another day. So the Pearl of Great Price also includes the Joe Smith's history, which he oversees the creation of, at least the part that's in the Pearl of Great Price, and then portions from the John Wentworth letter, which he writes or dictates to someone else to write. All of those sources are published and available and created during Joe Smith's life. Franklin D. Richards eventually compiles them when he is a mission president in England. He calls them his Pearls of Great Price. Those eventually get adopted as a new LDS scriptural canon in the 1870s. So I don't think, I'm not quite sure what you're meaning in that what we have in the Pearl of Great Price don't come directly from Joseph Smith, beyond the fact that I just know that there are some who are almost dismissing anything connected to Joseph Smith that they don't think finds these pure origins. I think this has grown out of this polygamy denial movement where people are saying not everything that we have that we claim is from Joseph Smith is actually from Joseph Smith. I just saw the other day someone commenting in one of these groups that they deny that Joe Smith even ran for president or created the Council of 50, that even those things were later creations by Brigham Young editing the history. And I think we're not far off from when some people just claim that Joe Smith never existed in Nauvoo, but that's a story for another day. I have my buddy Anthony, the producer, saying that Pedro Pascal should play Joseph Smith. I mean, he's playing everything nowadays, so I could get behind him playing Joseph Smith as well. Okay, let's see. On a recent trip, my family was discussing the Mormon lore of Cain being Sasquatch. Where does this idea originate? And why do so many current members still believe this myth? That's a great question. That story comes from a much later reminiscence of someone saying that they spoke, that David Patton saw Sasquatch. This would have been during the 1830s, but the reminiscence comes from much later. And that David Patton then spoke to Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith said that was actually Cain, and part of Cain's punishment was meant to roam the earth, and so that's Sasquatch. I might be garbling some of the details, but that's a gist. The Journal of Mormon History a couple of years ago did a fundraiser where they created a shirt with Sasquatch and the quote of David Patton. David Patton was an early member of the Quorum of the 12. Why does that persist? There is a wonderful article, one of my favorite articles by the scholar Matt Bowman, who I believe is the best scholar in Mormon history, who wrote an article on the Mormon Bigfoot, because he dove into all these folklore accounts that are housed at the BYU archives that capture that capture these Mormon stories of Bigfoot. Now, I don't think I need to tell anyone here that Mormons have a big folkloric canon, and Bigfoot is one of those. And what he teases out the evolution. So I strongly recommend just Google Mormon Bigfoot Matthew Bowman, and you'll find the article online. I will note one fascinating element that he teased out. Most of the Mormon folklore accounts of Bigfoot before 1978 refer to him being black. Most of the Mormon folklore accounts of Bigfoot after 1978 no longer refer to him being black. I'll leave you to deduce what that means. Thanks again to Prof or Not for the donation. I really appreciate it. Okay, let's see. How does that compare to other 19th century movements that use marriage alliances for political cohesion? I imagine that was that comment was left. Oh, sorry, that's connected to a previous comment. How do you? Oh, and also Joyful Day mentioned affair can refer to situation, not necessarily a romantic liaison. You're right, and this is Oliver Cowdery talking about Fanny Alger, and he also refers to it as scrape, which has different meanings. I in my own research, I've tried to tease through those words, and I know some say that the affair that Oliver Cowdery referred to is actually the Kirtland Safety Society. I end up, given the context, I think it's pretty clear that he's referring to a romantic alliance, but I understand that there are differences of opinion. How do you see early Mormon polygamy functioning as a tool for structuring and consolidating political power, especially in contexts like the Nauvoo Leadership Network? Also, how does that compare to other 19th century movements that used marriage alliances for political cohesion? That's a great question from Trevor. Thank you for asking that. First, so let me talk about the theology and then I'll talk about the practice. I think the theology behind polygamy, as Joseph Smith taught it, was quite clear. That he was trying to create, as he put it, a network of belonging that were going to tie people together in a way that could survive the throes of democratic chaos. One of my favorite images to describe the early Mormon theology of polygamy is a diagram of the kingdom of God, drawn by Orson Hyde, who is an LDS apostle, published this in about 1845. In which he depicts the kingdom of God as basically a family tree. And that at every point, there are people who are in charge, these patriarchs who have authority. And then people are sealed to them to buttress this eternal kingdom, this sacred chain of being in which everyone is going to have their place. This is why polygamy has to be understood with the other theological development of adoption, of adults being sealed to these families as children. So I think theologically speaking, it was meant to create these kinship networks that operated as a hierarchical leadership, a dynasty, this dynastic authority. I think Todd Compton's article Toward a Theology of Polygamy really ties this dynasty element together. And functionally speaking, in practice, it did create some families who had more authority than others. One of the most poignant letters to me in 1845, 1846, when polygamy is starting to be well known in Nauvoo, is this woman who sends writes this letter to Brigham Young that you can read in the Brigham Young collection at the Church History Library as digitized. She writes this letter to Brigham Young saying, I want to have a high place in the kingdom, which means I don't want to be sealed to any average saint. I want to be sealed to you. This was a woman pitching to be sealed to Brigham Young, which shows that it was a way to place yourself within this Mormon hierarchy. And that even goes beyond the point that after Joseph Smith dies, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball divide the women who were sealed to Joseph Smith and seal those women to them, almost showing that they are physically taking on the family of Joseph Smith, which I think shows how it operates. How does that compare to other 19th century movements that use marriage alliances for political cohesion? I think it's very similar. I mean, remember, they're living on the American frontier. And one of the ways that people built communities on the frontier were these strategic familial alliances that formed systems of allegiance to one another to bring some form of stability to what they saw as an anarchic world. So yeah, I think that's this is actually a primary argument in my book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, where I argue that much of Joseph Smith's Nauvoo theology is in response to what they saw as the excesses of democracy. All right. Thank you for the donation from Ahmed Bundy. I really, really appreciate it. Let's see. I just scrolled down and suddenly it brought a lot of new comments. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Will you please do a video on Mormon counterfeiting or currency? I keep hearing about that peripherally. Is there not a lot known? The answer is no, there's not a lot known. There's very early scholarship, and I want to emphasize I'm not an expert on it. Joseph Johnston is a phenomenal amateur historian living out near Nauvoo, who's actually done what I think is the best work on recovering Nauvoo counter currency. What I do think is clear is that these counterfeiting was taking place in Nauvoo. How broad it was is still up for debate. And what was clear is that Brigham Young, this is after Joseph Smith's death, although Joseph Smith might have been involved in the early stages, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and other church leaders were in trouble due to counterfeiting. There was a federal investigation into counterfeiting in Nauvoo. This is why you might have heard the story, the famous bogus Brigham story, when officials show up at the Nauvoo temple and they send out one of Brigham Young's bodyguard dressed as Brigham Young, and they arrest him, and it's not until later they realize it's not Brigham Young, and Brigham Young talks about the bogus Brigham. That's why the term bogus Brigham has a double meaning. A, because it wasn't the real Brigham, and B, bogus is the term used for counterfeited currency. And it was what forced the Mormons to leave Nauvoo earlier than scheduled, because the Illinois governor, Thomas Ford, convinced Brigham Young that the U.S. government was about to arrest them and surround Nauvoo if they didn't leave then. And that's why the Mormons left in February as opposed to April and May like they originally planned. And then a question that came with the donation that I really appreciate. What LDS held journals and documents besides the William Claytons would you most like to see released to the public? This is a great question, one I get often. An easy answer is, besides, I'd love to see the William Clayton diaries, and those will be released, I think, next year. I'm hoping so. I did a whole video on it. Make sure to go watch that. I'd love to see the early Utah era Council of 50 records. The Council of 50 operated as the church's theocratic government before the Utah Territory was organized. And so I want to see those documents. I wish those would have been released with the Nauvoo documents, but they weren't. My other answer might surprise you. First, I think there's documents that we don't even know exists that I would love to see. I mean, we didn't even know that the LDS Church had the John Taylor Revelation until they just released it this year. We didn't know that the church had the Book of Commandments and Revelations, the early manuscript Revelation books. So I bet there are documents that we don't know exist that I really hope we get access to. But the documents I know exist and I would love to exist might be a bit surprising. The LDS Church over the last 50 years or so have done these intense and systematic surveys of membership. You probably get those surveys where they ask you, how often do you read the scriptures? How often do you pray? How often do you attend church? That survey data is probably the richest accumulation of religious participation in modern America. And we have no access to any of that. I would love to get access to all that survey data because it would give us a better sense of what it actually means to be a modern Mormon, things that we only have a very small view on right now. How do you see the difference between the law of consecration United Order practice in Nauvoo compared to Kirtland? And how did their experience in Kirtland influence changes in practice? Well, the law of consecration wasn't really practiced in Nauvoo. They did try to pool resources, right? They're raising money for the Nauvoo Temple and for the Nauvoo house, but they were following along the major contours of American capitalism by that point. Richard Bushman makes an argument, not fully persuasive, but I see his case, that Joe Smith has left the law of consecration behind by he gets to Nauvoo, seeing it as a failed experiment in Missouri. And then, of course, it later tries to be resurrected by Brigham Young in territorial Utah. I think they learned from the Mormon experience that those critiques of capitalism and Mormonism in its first few years was a direct rejection of America's democratic and capitalistic order. That too many people were still bought into that capitalistic order. It was too hard to implement. And I think they learned that they're going to have to operate within a capitalistic society rather than a communalist society like early Mormonism wanted. Let's see. Benedict Cumberbatch is Joseph Smith. He plays everyone. I could buy it. Dane Cook to play Joseph Smith. Aaron Eckhart could play Joseph Smith. I mean, that would have been great. Let's see. Is it a myth that the Mormon Church abolished the restrictions against Black people just to save tax-exempt status? How important was the São Paulo Temple to abolish the restrictions of the Black people? If I were to make a pie chart of the different causes that led into the church reversing its racial restriction in 1978. By far, the biggest piece of the pie, maybe up to 80% of the piece of the pie, would be the São Paulo Temple. I often joke by saying there are 3 reasons why the church ended its racial restriction: Brazil, Brazil, Brazil. And meaning that the Brazil São Paulo temple represented something bigger, that to be a global faith, they could not operate on the racial taxonomy that shaped the white supremacist experience in America. That the racial restriction based in those identities of racial exclusion, that you can have a one drop rule, did not work in the broader world. And Sao Paulo, Brazil was a case study. So I actually argue in my book that when Spencer W. Kimball announced in 1975 that they were building a Sao Paulo temple, that he signed the expiration order for the racial restriction, because no way was that temple going to operate. I mean, this was in the day in Brazil when one of the missionary discussions was on family history and genealogy, so you could trace back and prove that you don't have African ancestry, and it just proved impossible. Now, did federal pressure play a role? Yeah. I think that BYU was facing some issues in the 1970s. Matt Harris's phenomenal book, Second Class Saints, points out a few examples. There were issues caused by scholars with the publication of by Lester Bush in Dialogue, Mormonism's Negro Doctrine, that showed that the doctrine didn't originate with Joseph Smith, that prompted some to wonder, well, where did the racial restriction come from, and can we overturn it? All of those things play roles, but I do think that the Sao Paulo temple was the biggest thing. Did Joseph Smith truly try to marry William Law's wife? What was that event? The answer is I don't know. That's one of the issues of Nauvoo polygamy that scholars still debate. William Law was introduced to polygamy in August of 1843 when Joseph Smith had Hiram Smith, or Hiram Smith convinced Joseph Smith. I don't know the order. But Hiram Smith presented before the Nauvoo High Council and William Law the D&C 132, the revelation. This is why, by the way, further evidence that D&C 132 dates from Nauvoo. It's presented to the Nauvoo High Council in 1843. William Law and his wife Jane debate polygamy over the next few months. I don't see any direct evidence of Joseph Smith approaching Jane Law as a plural wife. Now, he might have. He certainly did that with some other apostle's wife. Brigham Young even has a dream at one point during this time of Joseph Smith approaching him to be married to Brigham Young's wife, showing that it's at least an anxiety in Brigham Young's mind. I don't think that Brigham Young approached Jane Law as a plural wife, though, in part because I think William Law would have talked about it. So when William Law writes his expose, does the Nauvoo expositor, I think he would have brought it up. It might have happened. Maybe they considered it too personal. Maybe they thought that would have been a distraction. But yeah, it's possible, but I'm not sure. That's one of the murky eras. Okay, what led the de-emphasizing of certain portions of the word of wisdom, like limiting meat consumption? Have we not had any prophets who tried to promote vegetarianism? Thank you. This was actually a question I saw leading up to the video, so I'm glad I'm able to get to it. The word of wisdom was sent not by commandment or constraint, but by suggestion, as the introduction to the Revelation specifically says. And throughout the 19th century, there were some who pushed for the word of wisdom. Hiram Smith wanted all the saints to covenant to follow the word of wisdom. Joseph Smith did not. They said it was a suggestion. But throughout the 19th century, you had many Mormons drinking tea, drinking coffee. I mean, when someone broke into the Salt Lake Temple in 1911, I believe was the date, he found tobacco spittoons in the Quorum of the 12 and First Presidency meeting rooms. I mean, that shows how much that persisted in the 20th century. It's not until Heber J. Grant, who was a teetotaler, who supported prohibition, he rebelled against the Democratic Party when the Democratic Party no longer supported prohibition. That's one of the reasons he turned against FDR and shifted Mormons rightward. That's topic for another point. But it was during his presidency that the word of wisdom moves towards a commandment and something that you have to follow in order to get a temple recommend. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question was have we not had any prophets who tried to promote vegetarianism and urging the limiting of meat consumption? No LDS prophet has pushed that, but one LDS apostle has. John Widsoe and his wife Leah Widsoe, who was a granddaughter of Brigham Young, they were vegetarians, and they tried to shift the LDS interpretation of the word of wisdom more toward vegetarianism. They weren't very successful. They were in the minority, but they are at least one example of people who did interpret who did interpret the word of wisdom to push toward vegetarianism, even if they weren't fully successful. All right, we only have about 5 to 10 minutes left, so I'm going to start scrolling through the questions. I'm going to ask Anthony to make sure to leave in the comments any questions that I definitely need to get to. Let's see. If Joseph Smith started polygamy, should the church apologize for prevaricating it about it in the early days? That's a good question. At the very least, I think the church needs to acknowledge that Joseph Smith lied about it early on. Apologize for it. I'm not sure. I think there are other things I wish I'd see the church apologize for before they apologized Joseph Smith lying about polygamy. But I do think, and at least the church work is some ways acknowledging that Joseph Smith lied, but not far. I recommend those who haven't yet, go watch my video on the new topics and questions page on Joseph Smith's character that I think shows that the church still isn't fully willing to wrestle with the ramifications of how Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, that he directly lied about it. It was prevaricating. It was trying to avoid the truth in order to preserve his life and preserve his reputation and preserve the church. I think the more interesting question to me, and I might do this in a video in the future, is if Joseph Smith never dictated D&C 132, would the church now be viewing polygamy like they do the racial restriction as a cultural thing, not a divine thing? Maybe I'll unpack that in a future video. Can you explain what exactly was going on when Smith married was sealed to women who were already married? Were these really formalities, or were these marriages sexual or otherwise intimate too? That's a great question. And it's another part of the murky history of polygamy that I have my theories on, but I'm not fully formed on them. I'm not as convinced as, say, someone like Brian Hales, who's done a lot of research on this, that there was not a sexual component to those sealings with women who already had husbands. I think Joseph Smith's theology of polygamy, that dynastic tree that we've been discussing about, that we've been talking about, implied that sometimes it's not just adding a sealing to a family, but it's allowing a woman to rise up in the kingdom to a man. And I do think that you have to count in lust in some point of these sealings. What is the point behind it? Joseph Smith's D&C 132 talks about progeny being a outcome, a desired outcome of polygamy. Now, Joseph Smith never fathers children with his plural wives in Nauvoo, which shows the realities of having a secretive marriage system, and Joseph Smith having his time taken a lot of places. So my answer to what was going on with Joseph Smith with these women who are already married, I think it differed by circumstance. Some of these women were married to non-Mormon men. Some of these women were married to Mormon apostles. And so I think the reasoning might have been varied. And I think it's possible there was a physical component with some, but not with others. All right. Past changes have followed member pressure, reversing the early 1980s oral sex rule, the 1978 priesthood revelation, and the 2019 policy on baptizing children of LGBTQ parents. If members demand transparency in gospel topics essays, will leaders fix weak citations, or does that change differently? Thank you so much, Bob Jones, with your generous donation that went with that question. I think it's clear that LDS Church can respond to external pressure. They definitely have at moments in the past. And I'm sure they will in the future. And remarkably, and I think this is a surprising thing, they've admitted as such in recent years, both in response to progressive pushes. So when Russell Nelson and Dallin Oaks walked back their LGBTQ policy on children of queer families not being baptized, they said they are doing this to lower the temperature. That was, in my mind, one of the first times we've seen the church explicitly admit that they are giving into this external pressure. So I think that's fascinating. We also saw this when they walked back on the Masonry Temple murals, saying that it's due to the reaction that we decided to preserve those murals. I just wish that reaction was earlier so they could have preserved the Salt Lake Temple murals too, but that's another issue. And then, and so, yeah, I think we've had these, oh, and also, Jeffrey Holland, speaking at BYU a few years ago when he gave his musket fire address, said that he was doing this in direct response to donors raising issues. I have a friend, Michael Austin, who's a university administrator, who said that every university administrator's job is to respond to donor concerns. That's their first job. And the second job is to not admit that you're responding to donor concerns. And so Jeff Holland followed the first and the second. So will there be a push for the churches on more transparency on these gospel topic essays? And will they fix weak citations, or does that change work differently? I think we've already seen some changes. If you remember at the beginning of, was it this year or last year? My years are blurring together. When the church put out their cartoons on how to teach polygamy in early church history. And it included these cartoons showing Joseph Smith introducing plural wives. And there was a big Salt Lake Tribune story about it. And then within a few weeks, some of those cartoons were removed or they were adjusted. So I think it shows that they are responding to some. So yeah, I think there is external response. It has to meet a crucial point. And I think the response from public pressure doesn't always move in the more progressive way either. Let me give you one example. The recent gospel topics in question page on the church and race that came out, one of these Q&A pages that came out, I see in many ways a response to conservative concerns over the church's previous gospel topics essay on race and the priesthood and the Let's Talk About Race and the Priesthood book that Deseret Book published by Paul Reeve, because I think that Q&A page actually walks back some of the things that were found in that gospel topics essay and were found in Paul Reeve's book. So yes, I think the church responds to that pressure, but I think the pressure is multifaceted. Sometimes we see the pressure with the public campaign. Sometimes the pressure takes place quietly with, donors pressuring Jeff Holland to make BYU more conservative. And sometimes we see the pressure take place in the church history department. I think there's a lot of things that we've gotten in recent years that came as a result of the wonderful scholars who are employed by the LDS Church in Salt Lake City quietly pushing for more transparency and more openness and more scholarly advances, and eventually winning. And we don't get to celebrate their efforts because we just see the finished product. So yeah, to answer your question, Bob, I think that external pressure works, but not always, and it's often multifaceted. I saw, oh crap, I just scrolled past it, said if Joseph Smith was married to 35 plus women during his lifetime, don't you think at least one woman would have written down in his journal? I think one did. Eliza R. Stowe, in her diary, very coyly wrote about her sealing date. But I do think they were explicitly instructed not to leave detailed instructions. That's why one of the most important documents has at the end Brigham or Joseph Smith telling them to burn this paper after you're done. But I do think there is contemporary evidence. If you read Eliza R. Snow's diary entries, especially on the days that she was sealed, I think it's very clear what she's talking about, even if she's not coming out clear. Will you share what your own standing is as a church? I discussed that at the beginning of the video, so once it's posted, you can see this. Let's see. What do you think of the Handsome Lake story about Joseph being influenced by a Haudenosaunee teacher that has been researched by Tom Murphy? Any credibility to it in your mind? I'm interested in it. I think Tom Murphy is doing phenomenal work. I'm really excited for his book to come out. I am hesitant on any of these direct points of influence on anything, just because I don't think influence operates that way. But I do think there is a broader cultural influence going on that I think both the Haudenosaunee prophets and Joseph Smith are responding to. I wrote an article on using Thomas Dick's theology as an example of why I don't like direct links of connections, because I think they're often spurious and too tenuous, but instead we need to understand the broader culture that these people are responding to. How do you see the John Taylor eternal polygamy revelation affecting the last 125 years, if at all? I think the church is doing all it can not to let that document change the way they view the past history, because to acknowledge the post-manifesto history would mean acknowledging that church leaders were being a bit prevaricators. There's the word. You can tell I'm nearly at the end. So I think the fact that the church just posted the document without any history is saying a lot. Let's see. One more. John Hamer gave a good overview in the recent Center Place lecture of the case that Joseph disavowed polygamy before his death. Is this argument valid to you? No. I haven't seen John Hamer's argument. John Hamer is a good friend of mine. He's great. I would love to see him spell out that argument. I don't see Joseph Smith giving up polygamy. I do think he watered it down near the end, where he seemed to come to some agreement with Emma in the fall of 1843 that he would no longer take more plural wives. But I'd have to see that argument. But I like John. He does great work, so I'm open to listening to it from him. So we're getting down to the last three. Which Dan Vogel do you recommend? The Making of a Prophet or Charisma Under Pressure? I think Making of a Prophet is a classic. That's the one that covers up to January of 1831. Charisma Under Pressure covers the Kirtland years. I think Dan Vogel's work was a lot more innovative with the early period, but I still think that there's important stuff in the Charisma Under Pressure. So I like Making of the Prophet more than Charisma Under Pressure, but both are worth engaging. Thank you, Bert, so much for your donation. That was very kind. How do you navigate your expertise in Mormon history when speaking with people who have strong emotions about it, either fully believing members or those who have stepped away? It's difficult. When I was on my book tour for both American Zion and Kingdom of Nauvoo, I learned to speak to different audiences. And frankly, most people that I speak to don't know anything about Mormonism. And so I'm having to start at a foundation. I learned that the passion for Mormon history is an asset to the field. And what I mean by that is this: when you go to the Mormon History Association, every panel has lots of people in there listening to the session. If you go to the American Academy of Religion, panels have a lot of empty seats. That passion is a good thing. So when I try to talk to these audiences, I start at the point of that passion is a good thing. People care about this thing. So it's important for us to unpack the history. How do you let's see, how much do you have to practice diplomacy in your lectures and social media activity? I'm not good at practicing diplomacy. Many people can say I'm not allowed to speak at BYU for a reason, because I'm not able to curtail what I say in a certain way. And so how do you practice diplomacy? Not well. I mean, I try to recognize, I can read a room. I learned that I'm trying to work where an audience is and move from there, rather than being in a place where I know I'm going to immediately be rejected, whether I'm in with a believing audience or a rejecting audience. But I often think the great grounding factor is context. I think I can get in front of a group of LDS churches, like I speaking in front of a group of seminary kids who are about to go visit Nauvoo. And I can explain context to them in a way that will make them understand better their religious beliefs and the sacred narratives. Conversely, I think I can get in front of a Sunstone crowd and I could talk about context as something that can give meaning to these stories that they may not no longer believe in, but recognize as important. I think context is a great equalizer, and that's the thing that I emphasize more than any other. All right. We are over 90 minutes, and I plan to only go 90 minutes, and we're at about 100 minutes now. I want to thank everyone for bearing with me this whole time, for asking. I came with a list of questions in advance because I thought no one was going to be here, and I was just going to have to answer my own questions. And it turns out I didn't even have to go to those questions asked in advance because so many of you asked them. Please, if you haven't yet, hit the like button on this video so we can get more traction once it's posted as a video. Also, as a fun announcement coming up, we are going to be starting a channel memberships. I discussed this at the beginning of the video, but we will be doing channel memberships soon for those who want to give back to the channel. But I want to emphasize, all of what I do will still be available for free. Please share my videos with others so they can get a broader audience. These discussions are important. And I also want to thank Anthony, the man behind the scenes, for doing all this excellent work and dragging me onto YouTube in the first place and making all of this possible. And I want to thank all of you for showing up. So please hit the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Thank you for helping me pass the 5,000 hit list, and look for the memberships coming up. Again, thanks everyone, and have a great day.